Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Joining Silence to Shame in the soundtrack of mental health. And we'll get started. We'll give some people a couple more minutes to come in, and then we will start. I see some more people coming in. Awesome, awesome. We'll give everybody a couple more minutes. Not minutes, a couple more seconds to come in, and then we'll get started. Yes. All right. So once again, everyone, my name is Nia Bullock, and I am the program coordinator for Silence to Shame. And I'm here with Reginald Howard, and we are doing the soundtrack of mental health, complicated grief, suicide loss, and survivor's guilt. Today, we know it's going to be some sensitive topics. So if you have to step away or put it on mute, it's okay. Take care of yourself and make sure you take care of your mental health. Also know that if you do have to step away, this is going to be recorded and it's going to be available to you for 30 days after we are wrapping it up. So again, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Reginald Howard. Are you ready?
Yes. Thank you, Nia.
You're welcome.
Man, I loved having these webinars, and I love everybody being participating. I know you all can't, communicate back with me, but we will have an involved conversation today. So in the chat right now is a bit of an icebreaker. I'm gonna talk about a little bit about myself before we get into the presentation. But just let me know where you're from by the food that you are. So, for example, I'm in Philly right now, so I would put a cheesesteak in the chat if I was on the opposite end. So let me know where you're from right now by what food your city represents. So again, I will be the Philly cheesesteak. I will put it in there with some fried onion, salt, pepper, ketchup, just to let people know where I'm coming from. So let me know in the chat. I'll look at it later. But without further ado, let's get started. So Silence to Shame presents to you the soundtrack of mental health. It is the first installation of the Workplace Wellness Series to empower employees and companies to prioritize their mental well-being. And I love conversation like this. Now, again, my name is Reginald Howard. I am a contractor for Silence to Shame. And my day job, I work at the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia. At night, I'm a father and a husband, and I just try to manage it all by being sane. So without further ado, we're going to get started. This series is sponsored by the Sony Music Publishing Group through their Global Social Justice Fund to recognize mental health disparities and lessen the impact of mental illness. Today, we will explore the complicated grief, suicide loss, and survivor's guilt for of all those who we have lost. So it's going to be an intense conversation. Again, just like Nia said in the beginning, if you have anything that comes up, please take time for yourself. We don't want to trigger anybody, but we're going to have a good conversation with a lot of information. So, but we want you to take care of yourself further and foremost. So let's get started. But first, let me share a little bit about the organization. Silence to Shame is a nonprofit founded by music executive veteran Shanti Das. Due to the loss of her father and close friends to suicide, Das shares her story of depression and suicide ideation to peel back the layers of shame and access professional help. As a result, Silence to Shame was formed to eliminate mental health stigma, reduce health disparities, and improve rates of suicide among marginalized populations such as communities of color, older adults, children, and more. And I respect Shanti a lot. I've been following the work for a long time, and I'm happy to work with the organization because it's doing great work out here. All right, so before we start, I want to bring to your attention to the present. Please in this moment, be where your feet are. We like to be in the moment where we are. I know we got a lot going on. It's midday, probably thinking about getting off work, but just be in this space with each other, because this might be the only time you get this space for the day. So I would love for you to practice self-compassion with yourself to access positive emotions. This exercise can be used to develop a more compassionate way of relating to oneself by creating new self-compassionate physical habits under challenging times. This exercise aims to create a more self compassionate attitude and reaction in difficult times. All right, so start by taking a moment to pause thoughts and actions with a deep breath. So, and I actually did that wrong. It should be in your nose and out your mouth so that it can slow down the breathing. So, notice how your body feels. Move your hand to your chest, hug yourself, or just make any physical contact with yourself in some other way and take a few deep breaths. That felt good. I like to link it to like and I'm not a smoker, but I've heard individuals utilize that, opportunity, that individuals that, do that to deep breaths. So if you think about someone who smokes, they go to off to the side, they take those deep breaths and let it out. And that's usually when you're saying somebody's angry, or they need to take a moment to themselves. Hey, take a deep breath. So finally, acknowledge your emotions in these moments. The aim is not to become overwhelmed by the pain or emotion, but to acknowledge it as real and hurtful while permitting yourself to feel it. All right, let's get into today's discussion. That felt good. I might do a few of these throughout the presentation. So in today's discussion, we will explore the stages of grief and the impact of getting stuck. Describe the unique challenges of grieving a suicide loss and review strategies to navigate complicated grief and relieve survivors' guilt. We will learn research-based information related to mental and physical health. In addition, there will be short videos, mentaludes of our people who are share experience and heal from the experts, are from the subject matter experts. So if you listen to it's going to be some podcast interviews in here as well. And I'm a big fan. So make sure you subscribe to that as well, because you get in-depth information from Silence to Shame. Remember to utilize the chat function today. I want this to be an interactive, engaged, presentation. Again, I hope I get to see your foods in there as well. But let's talk about understanding grief and loss. Many people are experiencing grief during the pandemic. And we just got out of COVID, but it's not as intense as it once was, but it's still happening. It's always new variants coming out. Grief is the normal process of reacting to a loss. Grief reactions may be felt in response to physical losses, so for example, a death, or symbolic or social losses, for example, like divorce. Each type of loss means the person has had something taken away. Grief is a process that doesn't follow linear or predictable stages. The spectrum of emotional, cognitive, social, and behavioral disruptions is broad, ranging from barely noticeable changes to profound anguish and difficulty functioning. It's important to note, pay attention, it's important to note that grief is never fully completed. Instead, it is adapting to the loss and that changes you. So think about it as this: like, people will say, "Oh, that happened so many years ago. Get over it. Like, you should be past that." It's a never-ending cycle. You'll continue to find ways to navigate and get through your grief. We talked about losses, and I want to get into it a little later in the presentation, but and it might be actually coming up. I lost a very important role at a position that I was a part of as my profession, and my profession was tied to my identity. And I had no idea when I lost the opportunity with the profession that I lost a part of myself, and I was grieving like I had lost a person. And I'm like, man, I lost my identity because I was grieving that position, and it really hurt me and it traumatized me still to this day, because I'm still redefining and refiguring myself out. So when you think about grief, don't think out about it in one way. It can happen in many forms. So defining the terms, let's get into that. Grief, bereavement, and mourning are often used interchangeably. However, they have different meanings. Grief is a normal process of reacting to a loss. Grief can be in response to a physical loss, such as a death, or a social loss, including a relationship or a job. I just spoke about it. Bereavement, the period after a loss during which grief and mourning occurs. Bereavement depends on the circumstances and the level of attachment to the person who died. So, mourning is the process by which people adapt to a loss. Cultural beliefs, practices, ritual beliefs greatly influence mourning. Mourning is how we grieve, and losses are shown in public. So I'm going to get into a video shortly, but a brief synopsis about the video is it's important to understand that grief is a response to losses we experience. We will hear our first healing expert to explain those losses. Dr. Robinson is a licensed professional counselor and a grief trauma expert. In addition, she's a professional transformation speaker and corporate trainer with over 15 years of professional and on-stage experience. So we get into something where you got the experts in the building where they're about to give you some real knowledge around grief. So please take some time in the video. Enjoy the video.
So symbolic losses are ones that do not involve death or the physical loss of, let's say, a limb or those things, but they're loss of identity, loss of control, loss of safety, loss of our role in relationships, right, might trigger. And it can trigger the same grief process, but there's no physical loss that we are kind of honoring. But it is important to honor that, again, the grief process looks the same. It can sometimes be harder to recognize that we are grieving or to at least give ourselves permission to grieve because no one died, right? And so I think that piece is important, is to understand that we do grieve physical and symbolic losses in the cycle or the different aspects that we have to navigate through to get to a space of acceptance is important. And so I always recommend folks to identify what their needs are, particularly in relationships right now. We're seeing a lot. We're seeing that the inquiries for divorce is up 80%. And so one, we're not alone. And two, try not to make any major decisions. If we're not physically, spiritually, and emotionally being harmed, let's take a step back and identify what our needs look like now.
Man, thank you to Dr. Robinson for that. I got a chance to peek at the chat and what you all put in there about
So
I'm feeling
symbolic
grief.
losses are
Oh, I'm
ones that do
sorry.
not involve
I'm feeling
death.
grief and loss about the food that y'all having from y'all state. I seen catfish. I seen a bunch of things that I want a part of, but so I'm grieving a little bit that I don't get to enjoy it with you all. But again, going back in types of losses in all seriousness, these are the various types of losses. Sudden or shocking losses due to events like crimes, accidents, or suicide can be traumatic. They can challenge a sense of security and confidence in the predictability of life. As a result, one experiences sleep disturbance, nightmares, distressing thoughts, depressed mood, social isolation, and severe anxiety. Predictable losses like those due to terminal illness sometimes allow more time to prepare for the loss. However, feelings of loss are very personal and only you know what is significant to you. I'll give you all an example of a loss that I shared. I was in a car accident in 2018. Long story short, someone ran a red light and they T-boned me from like the driver's side to the passenger side. They took I was knocked unconscious. Someone had to come pry me out the car and call an ambulance for me. I actually still got like a little scar, if you can see right here, where they had to put like a metal chip. My leg was broken open, and I got a metal rod in my leg. And again, I couldn't do nothing to prevent that in those moments. In that moment, I was in the hospital, breathing tube, neck brace, all the above. And if I never shared this, no one would know. But a part of the reason why I share that story is when you grieve a loss, I had to grieve the loss that I wouldn't have my body the same way it was before. My legs still, I say it's like a battery. Like I got 100% when I wake up, but by the end of the day, depending on the activity, if I'm at an airport, if I'm running around with my kids, or if my leg starts to go numb, and sometimes I grieve that, fact that my body is not the same and I have to deal with certain things that another person doesn't deal with, and then still feeling like a man in my household because I'm not as strong as I would like to be. I also had to realize and adapt to my new lifestyle, and how that was supposed to be. So loss again, because it's not predictable. Like it wasn't something that was preventable. I still go out at night and I'm still afraid, if I'm being honest, and still have PTSD that I deal with because I lost that security that I had within myself and that confidence in driving. And so when you think about these different, types of losses and sudden and shocking losses due to events, it can happen to any one of us, and we have to know how to, deal with that over time, or learn anyway. And this is what this presentation is going to do. So grief is a personal process. Grief is a personal process cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These phases are attempts to process change through self-preservation and adapting to a new reality. I just talked about that with my ex, and I had to adapt to a new reality. Typical grief reactions involve mental, physical, social, and emotional responses. These reactions can include numbness, anger, guilt, anxiety, sadness, and despair. In addition, the individual can experience difficulty concentrating, sleeping, and eating problems, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, physical issues, and even illness. Again, going back to the accident, when I talk about grieving, I was scared to take the main roads after a while. I took a lot of back streets, a lot of, inconvenient routes, because I was afraid to get back with that speed and flow of traffic. And still to this day, like I said, like I was out a night ago and I seen all the lights, and I had to pull over and like gather myself. And I was just going out to get some milk for the family, and I was scared, and I pulled over and I parked. So it continues to have different effects, not just physical, but mentally and socially as well, because I may not want to go out with friends because I know I might have to deal with insecurities that I don't feel like sharing in those moments. The reconstruction phase of grief begins working through the aftermath of a loss. As you become more functional, your mind starts working again, and you will find yourself seeking realistic solutions to problems posed by life without your loved one. You will begin to work on practical and financial issues and reconstruct yourself and your life. Finally, acceptance is understanding that there is a finality to what has happened to you. It is acknowledging the loss, adapting to the new experience, and moving forward. Accepting a loss does not mean you get over it, but unfortunately, given the complexities of the process, you never return to you that existed before the loss. And again, like some people never get back. I know my mom recently lost her spouse, and she still is not recovered in the way that she would like to be. And because I have to explain to her a lot, you're never going to be that version of yourself anymore. You have to adapt to the new person you are. Although everyone, going to the next slide. Although everyone experiences grief uniquely, there is a healthy flow of emotions gradually moving toward acceptance. However, some conditions or situations occur that cause various types of grieving. Anticipatory grief is experienced when a loss is expected, such as a loved one with a terminal illness or someone moving away. The emotional experience can make it challenging to enjoy the time left. Complicated grief occurs with persistent symptoms over an extended length of time that interfere with the functionality. Disenfranchised grief occurs when a loss is not socially recognized. Are you enjoying the presentation thus far? Is it very informative? Put it in the chat. Again, this is an engaging conversation. Put it in the chat. How are you feeling about the presentation so far? All right, let's move into complicated grief. Complicated grief is like a constant hiding state of mourning that keeps you from healing. Symptoms of complicated grief include disbelief, a preoccupation with the loss, distressful memories, and an inability to move on with one's life, and a yearning for the loss. Some mental health professionals diagnose complicated grief when grieving continues to be intense, persistent, and debilitating beyond 12 months. Some pre-existing factors may increase the likelihood of experiencing complicated grief, such as a history of mental illness, limited social support, and fewer years of education dependency, and attachment traits, family conflict at the end of life, and difficulty accepting death. So it's a lot of information when it comes to complicated grief, and you have to see the factors that are playing towards your grief in that moment. So let's move on to disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is when your grieving doesn't fit in with the larger society's attitude about dealing with death and loss. The lack of support you get during your grieving process can prolong the emotional pain. Finding social supports and sympathy for the disenfranchised grief can be difficult. That's why I'm grateful for organizations like Silence the Shame and other resources that will, provide at the end of this webinar, because there may not be the support that you're looking for when it comes to the specific grief you're dealing with. And so we try to cultivate certain environments so that way you can receive that information where you may not naturally get it. So back to disenfranchised grief. Due to the type of loss, there are no formal mourning practices or recognition by others that would comfort the grieving individual. Consequently, individuals experience the disenfranchised grief may suffer intensified symptoms due to the lack of social support. So not only are you dealing with your regular grief, the grief, the disenfranchised grief is in general, it's intensified because you don't find the support that you're looking for in that moment. So examples of disenfranchised grief include dementia of a loved one, addiction of a loved one, death of an ex-partner, death of the abuser, death of a patient, death of a pet, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different griefs that aren't acknowledged, but they are grieving at the end of the day. Again, I just learned about, losing a job or losing a profession or losing a career as a type of grief. And I never thought it would affect me in that way. And some of my colleagues and coworkers are like, hey, you'll always find another position. You'll always find another whatever. And it's like, that's not as easy as it sounds, especially when it's so much tied to your identity. All right, and again, we're going to talk about suicide in this moment. So again, take care of yourself. If anything comes up, please do the best to take care of yourself in this moment. We don't want to, cause harm or anyone throughout this webinar. So, suicide loss and survivor's guilt. Survivors of suicide losses are spouse, children, parents, siblings, grandparents, military buddies, and friends who had a relationship with the deceased individual. Losing a loved one to suicide is one of life's most painful experiences. The feelings of loss, sadness, and loneliness experienced after the death of a loved one are often magnified in suicide survivors by feelings of guilt, confusion, rejection, shame, anger, and the effects of stigma and trauma. A death by suicide is usually sudden, often unexpected, and may be violent. These factors increase the degree of shock and trauma experienced compared to many other types of bereavement. In addition, survivors may struggle to make sense of whatever has happened in that moment, and fundamental beliefs may be challenged. Therefore, survivors of suicide loss are at a higher risk of developing complicated grief. Suicide survivors face unique challenges that can impede the normal grieving process, putting survivors at increased risk for developing complicated grief, concurrent depression, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. These conditions can lead to prolonged suffering, impaired functioning, and adverse health outcomes, and even death if untreated. So let's get into bereavement after suicide. Bereavement by suicide can bring an intensity and range of emotions and physical reaction which may be unfamiliar. Survivors often feel rejected and abandoned by those who take their own lives. That rejection may lead to survivors thinking that they are worthless in that moment. As a result, they may isolate themselves from those who could provide relief and support. I always was taught that isolation, when you have those suicide ideations, and you need to be around people, even if it's around people that can't help you in that moment, but just taking your mind in that space of like, you know what, let me be where my feet are in that moment, and maybe they can notice a sign of, hey, you're not your normal self. Is there anything that you want to talk about? Most people do not want to talk about suicide. In general, people think it's better not to say anything, hoping that by ignoring the suicide, survivors will get over the trauma more quickly. However, the silence surrounding suicide survivors place them in danger of further shame. And if others are embarrassed, uncomfortable, and elusive, survivors will inevitably feel isolated and want to protect themselves. In many instances, the guilt that they may have, should have done something to prevent the suicide. And so everybody always, look back afterwards like, I seen this sign, or I think I could have done something. And that guilt weighs heavy on your heart because you think you could have done something better in those moments. Suicide stigma is stigmatized and largely misunderstood. While mourners, people who are mourning, usually receive sympathy and compassion, the suicide survivor may encounter blame, judgment, or exclusion. Anger can be intensified for survivors of suicide. There may be a disconnection from loss due to how it was experienced in that moment. So it's a lot going on when you have to deal with bereavement after suicide. And presentations like this are so important because they give you the tools necessary to deal with it. If you're a person that has to ever have, and I hope no one ever had the experience, because this was a part of my story and my journey. Is I'm a two-time suicide attempt survivor, and I didn't know that until I got into counseling. And so and the only ways I learned is because I got education and tools and resources like this, and was able to, use my story or use the things that I've learned to pass on to others. So these conversations and these trainings are so important because you don't know how much they can impact people that may be suffering in silence. So let's talk about the emotional roller coaster. The course of grief is so unpredictable. Anniversary reactions can delay time for longer and make it seem longer than what it is. During an anniversary reaction, you might experience the intense emotion and reactions that you first experienced when you lost a loved one in the first place. In addition, birthdays, holidays, and other significant events may trigger feelings of loss. Generally, the first year, with all of its first, will be the toughest, but these events may always be challenging. Like I said earlier, my mother lost her spouse during the pandemic. In that first year, so that she experienced a lot of grief during the pandemic, as a lot of us, where she had a loss of job, had a loss of spouse, and had a loss of a best friend during that time. And it was just too many things happening at once. It was, all right, this is my spouse's birthday. This is his death day, the day he passed away. These are the days that we like to do. So it comes up in all these different emotions come up, and you think you're fine one day, and then a song will play, and then you're not fine. And so it's a bit of emotional roller coaster that occurs in those moments. Unfortunately, some losses draw more stigma than compassion. The reaction of others might make you feel ashamed or embarrassed instead of comforted. Suicide loss may lead others to judge you or criticize you, leaving one to grieve by themselves. Be prepared to for those painful reminders, like I spoke of earlier, those songs on the radios, those scents of their favorite dishes. We talked about food. We talked about different things that remind you of certain things. So like a photograph could be that as well. And it can bring on a sudden feeling of sadness, even though the sensation that you're reliving the experience. Let me rephrase that. Even the sensation that you are reliving the experience of the suicide, if that's how they lost their life. Now we're about to move into a video talking about suicide loss. Let's hear from Willie Moe Jr. on surviving loss of a loved one to suicide.
And I will never forget hearing my auntie's voice. And she said, "Something has happened to Dante, please come." I walked in, I grabbed my keys. I said, "Guys, I gotta go." And I ended up going to the hospital. Nobody told me exactly what had happened until I arrived at the hospital. And they said Dante had hung himself. And I said, "No, this can't be, I don't get it. I don't understand." They said, "Can you just go to the room?" And I remember going into the room as he laid there on the bed with this little white thing, little plastic thing in his mouth. And I was stunned. And I began to pray. And I was like, "God, this cannot be the truth." And I went out and I began to encourage my family. And this just rocked our family in a way that we've never been rocked before, because mental illness was nothing that we had ever seen in our family. Of course, not a 14-year-old boy with such a life in a well-to-do areas of St. Louis. But what had happened was that he had been teased in high school, and his mother took him out of school for that particular day. And she said, "Well, you'll spend the day with me, get your bearings back together, but tomorrow, baby, you got to go back to school." School had become Terra High School for him. The name of the school is Parkway South, but it was Terra High School. He was so afraid of what those children were going to do, to be made fun of and talked about. Because he came from a well-to-do family, he talked different than other African-American boys in his school. So they called him white boy. "Oh, you Mr. Proper guy." He had a larger array and a kaleidoscope of people that he had connected with. And so his experiences were different. And every parent across the country is doing its best to give their African-American boys and any other type of boy a different experience than they had. But they made fun of him. And so he thought the best option for him was to take his life. How's our family been doing since this has happened? We're a lot more careful. I'll start with the positive parts of it all. We're a lot more careful with our children when they're having these different emotional issues. We don't just say, hey, you can do it and you can go ahead. If somebody even mentions the thought of suicide, we're putting them on the phone with counselors. We're making sure that we're not filing away the information and just saying, hey, this is just something that they're going through. We're taking everything seriously. Our family has never been the same since that day. We're now learning how to celebrate him in a way. We have a walk that we do for Adante. We have a scholarship fund for Adante. And his mother has just shown so much resilience in the last 3 years. Of course, the first 7 years were very, very tough for her. But now she's talking about it and she's getting in front of those students and telling them exactly what happened with Adante in hopes that other children would choose life instead of death. We believe this, that we should never make a permanent decision on a temporary situation. And that's our messaging that we've been giving the kids all across the country.
Thank you to the good brother Willie Mo Jr. One thing that I wanted to share, because I follow Willie Mo as well, that he just sparked in my mind, and I don't know how applicable it is to our conversation right now. But when I go and talk to students and talk to kids in the classroom, or even college kids that's at university, I tell them all the time, you shouldn't feel alone in a room full of people. And the only reason why we feel alone in a room full of people is because we're all trying to mask what we're going through. And we're all trying to find ways to, like, I hope you don't see me. And when you show up, you think somebody sees everything that you're going through. And it's like, oh man, do you see me right now? Like, I want to get more, I want to shrink in myself in that moment. So I try to tell them all the time, don't feel alone in a room full of people. We are all going through certain type of stresses and certain type of things. And if we, silence the shame of those things, no pun intended, then we can have a more healthy and proactive society if we, show our vulnerability. So that's why I choose to share my story, because I never want to fall alone in a room full of people. All right, let's move on to survivor's guilt. And again, this is an interactive presentation. I know you all are chatting. I took a brief view at that, but please let me know how the presentation is. We love feedback. We love, making this presentation something that you all will benefit from. And taking the time out your day, we really appreciate that. So please let us know how we're doing. Survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is a particular kind of guilt that develops in people who have survived a traumatic situation. For example, most suicide survivors need to understand the death and why the person ended their life in the first place. While guilt is not a grief response specific to death by suicide, it is not uncommon for a survivor to view suicide as an event that can be prevented. Therefore, it is easy for survivors to get caught up in self-blame and thinking that, hey, woulda, coulda, shoulda, what can I did better? What was the sign that I could have looked out for? Survivors of suicide are more likely, than other bereaved individuals to develop symptoms of PTSD. Following a trauma, people may also experience feelings of regret. They may ruminate over the events and think about what they coulda, shoulda, done in that moment to change the outcome. This rehashing of the events can further exacerbate guilt, particularly if people feel their actions or their inability to act have worsened the consequences. So you always have that in the back of your mind. And when I talk to my friends, and more into my story a little bit, because we're only here for a short time, but a little bit of insight. When I was experiencing suicide ideations, one of the attempts, I reached out to friends and family, and I texted them and told them, take care of my son. I don't want to be here anymore. That was me reaching out for support in that moment. Again, I didn't have the language. I didn't have the knowledge to say, hey, I'm struggling over here, and I would love somebody to come show me some love and give me some tools. And I should have been in somebody's crisis hospital at that time, but I didn't have the resources. I didn't know of a silence the shame at that moment, and just learning about what I'm going through emotionally, especially as a man in figuring those things out. And so I share that because once I spoke to friends and family members or the people that got that text message, they in their mind, it was like, I wish it was something I could have done. So even in an attempt, people feel like, what is something I can do to, get you out of those states? And that's why community and support is so important, because there are people that love you when it comes to these different things. And you don't know that until you reach out and let them know how much you need them. So let's go on to the next slide and get into coping with grief and loss. Grief is a universal emotion. There is no right or wrong way to experience it, and all the losses are significant. No matter how big or little they are. Here are some ways to cope with the feeling of grief. Acknowledge your losses and the feelings. Make sure you're paying attention to it. Some people express grief and find comfort through art, gardening, writing, talking to friends or family, cooking, music, gardening, or other creative practices. For me, I learned to put my problems in the gym. I heard a rap lyric a long time ago. It's like, my problems hit the gym, they all work out. And I always go in with that. So I try to put, when I'm feeling a certain type of way, like put that energy into something that you can produce something from. So even when we talk about music, cooking, there's an outcome that comes from it. So these creative pockets, they help you stay focused and on the present in the moment to reduce that worry of future losses. All right. So let's talk about coping with disenfranchised grief. So when you're coping with disenfranchised grief, you have to connect with people that have similar experience to emotional and social support. Not everyone can find empathy with you or support you in the way that you're looking to heal from. Connect with friends and family who understand your relationship with the loss and are willing to validate your emotions. It was so helpful when I went through my car accident. Uh, to have other people that went through that. So when I talked to someone that didn't have any limbs or someone that was paralyzed, I started to become a little bit more grateful for my situation, because virtually, if I don't tell anybody that I was in that situation, they wouldn't know. And it was like, man, you understand what I'm feeling right now. You understand, and you're giving me ways to pass by this emotion in this moment, or at least manage it. Anonymous support also helps many people working through loss. Local support groups in your area, or even online communities such as Silence the Shame, can connect you with people trying to navigate these complicated feelings or disenfranchised grief. Engage in memory rituals to mourn your losses. Rituals can offer closure and help people deal with the loss. However, if the loss is disenfranchised, there may not have been an official ritual like a funeral or other memorial. Creating and engaging in your practice can help you reach a point of acceptance that enables you to move forward. So here goes some examples of rituals that you can do in those moments. You can box up an ex possession after a breakup, writing a letter to say goodbye, planting a tree in your loved one's honor, making a collage of photograph and mementos, holding on to holding a memorial on your own in a place that has a significance. When I talked about losing that profession earlier, one of the things that helped me was getting rid of anything that reminded me of it. Like, I couldn't be reminded of it. And again, it felt like a breakup. I was mourning in that process and grieving in that process, but I had to get rid of any memorabilia, pins, hoodies, anything that could remind me of that space, because I wanted to, start over and not get reminded or triggered in those moments. And last but not least, don't feel ashamed to talk to a mental health professional for grief counseling. They can help you express and manage your feelings and find healthy coping tools. Additionally, additional support, last but not least, is to just find support groups like this or information like this that you can provide healthy coping mechanisms in those moments. They may not be professional help, but they can get you right until you get to the professional. All right, let's go into integrated grief. There is no set timeline for grief. We spoke about that earlier. You may feel like it goes up and down. You may feel like you're over something, but tomorrow you have just as much of a right to begin grieving again. And anyone who tells you to move on or get over it underestimates and misunderstands the weight of a loss. Integrated grief, the enduring, residual form of suffering in which the reality and meaning of a loss are gradually understood, and the bereaved can embark on a pleasurable and satisfying relationship and activities. Integrated grief does not mean the individuals forget their loved ones. It doesn't mean that they'll miss them any less or stopping the feeling of sadness when they think about them. Instead, the loss becomes integrated into the autobiographical memory system, meaning that the thoughts or the memories of the deceased are no longer as preoccupying or disabling. Like, you still remember them, you still enjoy their the feeling that they gave to you, but it's not taking up as much space as it once did. The individual finds a way of staying connected to the dead without their physical presence. Once an individual grief has become integrated, they can better become engaged in other activities without sorrow constantly preoccupying that space in their mind. For many, integrated grief will be a permanent, regular, and healthy stage. The bereaved will continue to feel heartache for the rest of their lives and will never stop missing their loved ones, and nor would nobody want you to. But the symptoms of grief are no longer debilitating, like you don't feel them as severe as you once did. They have made sense of the loss and accept the reality from it. So we're about to go hear from one of the experts again. They're going to offer tips about managing grief and connecting with others during the bereavement process.
Just like loss and the grief itself is individual, I think the treatment is individual as well. When we're talking about a child, particularly a child losing a parent, I would recommend them seeking counseling immediately. As an adult, if they have experienced a complicated loss, a sudden death of someone, etc., I definitely would recommend immediate counseling. For other people, it just depends. If they have a strong faith community or just a social support system, that may be all they need to help them get through it. The main thing is that when we are trying to comfort someone who has experienced a loss, it would really behoove society if people understood the type of comments that they say to people. If someone experiences a loss and they say, well, at least, don't ever say that to someone.
Yeah.
You lose a child, well, at least you have another child. Well, that has nothing to do with the person losing that child.
And even people, when sometimes they lose a loved one or grandparent or parent that's like in their 90s, well, at least they lived a good life. Yes, they did, but it's still a loss.
Yeah.
And they still have to go through that grieving process.
Exactly.
Wow. And I just saw the chat as well. Thank you from the healing from the experts, but I saw the chat. I'm going to borrow what someone said in the chat. Please, let's pray. I pray for good spirits and, send my blessings to everyone who had experienced this as well, because I know this can, bring up some things that you probably haven't experienced in a while. All right, let's get to coping after suicide loss in the workplace. Learning how to talk about suicide and sharing your own experience not only helps you, but it can also help others be more open about their mental health struggles. It can also help lessen the shame and stigma around suicide. When you silence the shame, people aren't afraid to speak up. Coping with losing a loved one in any circumstances is difficult, but losing a loved one by suicide can feel even more complicated because of the stigma attached to suicide. If you think you can talk about your loved ones and how they died for fear they'll be judged, you can feel alone in your grief. And again, what I said earlier, you shouldn't feel alone in a room full of people especially if we all lost a loved one and we know how that feeling is. Prioritize your health. Make sure you're attending doctor's appointments, maintaining a healthy sleep schedule, and staying active and eating balanced meals. Validate your emotions and connect with others who encourage you to share your thoughts. Grieve in your own unique way, and don't allow others to dictate how you feel in those moments. We just heard in the video or in the soundbite just now that even if you have a loved one that lived a full and healthy life, it's still a loss. You still don't have that person anymore, and you're still going to always want to have them in some capacity, even if it wasn't the best of capacity. You still want them, and so you still have. You can't let anyone dictate how you grieve, and you got your own way to deal with it. All right, let's talk about suicide prevention in the workplace. When a coworker dies or attempts suicide, there can be an overwhelming guilt and grief, even among those who may not have been close to the person. Employers should consider the impacts of the workplace overall psychological health and safety related to suicide. Employers play a critical role in setting the tone for how the rest of the workplace will respond to suicide. Managers should recognize their unique roles. On one hand, they may be impacted by the tragic loss and need support. On the other hand, they may be targets of anger and blame by other employees, depending on the circumstances of how the loss happened. Managers should take the lead in implying corporate human HR policies designed to help surviving family members with practical matters. This will show others that it's all right to reach out beyond the confines of the work environment to help. It's so good when you have a place that you work at and you know they're concerned about you professionally, but also personally and how you're doing because they affect each other. When connecting with employees, show compassion, maintain a respectable tone of empathy and support, and offer some permission to people to take care of themselves. Finally, be sensitive to anniversaries and notable events, and it might be appropriate to acknowledge the loss that the person. It might be appropriate to acknowledge the loss of that person's presence again. You can visit the Suicide Prevention Resource Center online to learn more about the suicide in the workplace. In addition, they offer resources to implement with managers and employees. All right, tips to cope with reawakening grief. I think I need to pass this slide over to my mom today because usually around the holiday season, the holiday blues kick in. So I will make sure to pass this along to her. Even years after a loss, you might experience feelings initially felt after the loss. Be prepared for reawakening grief associated with anniversaries, holidays, and old connections. We talked about anniversaries earlier. Try planning a distraction such as vacationing during the holidays. I know with my mom, what's the best positive distraction for her is when she's spending time with her grandkids and they're bringing happiness and enjoyment. She has the love and support the extra love and support she needs and feeling in that moment. Find positive ways to reflect on your relationship and how you can continue to honor its significance. You can also start new traditions such as planting trees or donating to a charity in honor of the loss of a loved one. Allow yourself to experience the range of emotions in that moment to work through the grief and move forward. All right. And here are some mental health resources, mental health and crisis resources. If you or someone you know experience severe or distressing symptoms that have lasted 2 or more weeks, don't wait until your symptoms become overwhelming. Instead, discuss your concerns with your primary care provider who can refer you to a mental health specialist if needed. Mental health services may be available to you through your insurance plan. And learn about your coverage options. That was one of the things I had to learn, that I was paying for insurance. I didn't even know I was paying for it. All the medical resources that was mental health resources that was available to me in that moment, I didn't even know I was paying for it. They was taking out the money out of my check and I still wasn't utilizing it. And so I'm trying to get better at that and utilizing, like, what are y'all taking all these taxes out for? Because I probably could be utilizing these services in a lot more ways that can support me in this moment to show up how I need to show up. And a few of these organizations I've had the pleasure of working with, specifically the National Alliance of Mental Illness, wherever you are in the world, they have a support group for you. So, or at least in the grassroots in the States, I can vouch for them because I'm on the board, and many other organizations. And again, Silence the Shame, we have a bunch of resources that we can point you towards as well. So please, again, utilize these resources. People are there to help. I said it earlier and I'll say it again. You shouldn't feel alone in a room full of people. You also shouldn't feel alone with a room full of support. These are all these organizations out here that's dedicated and they wake up every day to find ways to help individuals get through their mental health struggles and to provide the support they need in those moments. So please utilize these resources. And finally, before we get into some Q&A, I seen some interesting things in the chat. I know we went on an emotional roller coaster even in this conversation alone. I want to thank you for attending today's seminar, but I also know the organization Silence the Shame, we want to thank you. You heard those podcasts, you heard those small sound bites. This is what they hear more of it at the Silence the Shame podcast. We love it. We love it. We hope that it provides you the insight and encourages you to learn more about healthy relationships to support good mental health. The audio and video from content from this presentation can be found on the Silence the Shame TV on YouTube or podcast and several listening platforms. You do have a survey that you need to complete at the end of this. And you will be provided a certificate of your attendance. Am I missing anything else, Nia? Like, let me know.
No, you did amazing. I learned some things from this seminar. That was really, really great. And just, yeah, just like you said, you can find some more tools and resources on our webpage, on our website, on our Instagram. We're always sharing different things. But yeah, this was really, really good. Thank you so much for that, Reginald. I would like to say the chat was amazing as well. You guys were so supportive and engaging. I love to see it. I always say that it takes a community to get through things, and you guys were uplifting each other and giving advice in the chat. So that was really good. I did see some QPR training. We do have QPR training, not Silence the Shame, but in the community. I know that there's a place called Guides. They do QPR, and I actually, when our follow-up email, I'm gonna try to put some information in there where you can get some QPR training. Reginald, if you know any, well, you're in Jersey, right? So
Philly.
You're in Philly. You're in Philly. So yeah. So never mind, not you. But yeah, I didn't really see any questions.
Jamie QPR's question, persuade, respond.
Yes, sorry. That was one question. There's that. So yeah, and sometimes you can get suicide prevention. We have a lot of people who do suicide prevention in Atlanta area. If you are in the Atlanta area, oh, that's right. A lot of you are not from Atlanta. I have to keep remembering that like this is like national. So yes. A lot of you but yeah, so with that being said, if you look up the QPR trainings in your area, yes, find those trainings. Find suicide prevention, grief and loss. There should be some in your area. If not, I know people do online trainings all the time. So I would try to see if anybody does online, and I will send it to you guys in your email. As Reginald said, there is a survey at the end along with a certificate. So as soon as you log out of here, you will be prompted to go straight into the survey. And then after your survey, you will get a certificate. So yeah, any closing words, Reggie?
I just always thank you all for your time and attention. I know, again, we went through a lot of different conversations. Please let me know. Again, I like the feedback in the chat. This is my first time being able to see the chat, so please let me know how
you got a lot of feedback in the chat. You got a lot. People said that you were very helpful. Great presentation. This was good for them. So I love it. I love to see it. That means that we're here doing what we're supposed to do, and we're connected how we're supposed to connect in the community, because a lot of people, again, do not talk about these things. That's why Silence the Shame is here to help connect the resources and to connect the community to try to understand and try to give some mental health literacy in this world today, especially today.
Christine,
so yeah.
I thought it was for me. That was somebody else.
So I'm gonna end it now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your great feedback. Thank you again, Reggie, for your feedback as well. And we will see you guys next time.